Right, John, here we go with part 2 of our 2-part series on the flow state and flourishing. Today, we are talking to Dr. Gerrit McGowan and Dr. Jared Weintraub. Again, both former colleagues with Flow Research Collective, but really interesting and different conversation because Gerrit and Jared are really focused on, I think, flow in the workplace, right? Or flow in work-like environments. Yeah. So Gerrit is a 4-time startup founder. He's an angel investor. He's a coach for entrepreneurs, for CEOs. He really, I think, is kind of the brain behind cause-related loyalty marketing. He does kind of all-star mentoring for tech stars, you name it. If it's in the business world and it's about performance, flowiness, and how that kind of relates to overall flourishing, right, and optimization, Gerrit's into it. Tell us a little bit about Jared, though.
Well, Jared, like Gerrit, is also deeply involved in flow research and applying that research in the workplace. He's the founder of the Flow Group, LLC, which is an organizational and business development firm that works with individuals and companies to help them create and maintain happy, healthy, and productive workplaces, focusing on embedding, research in flow into workplace practices. His Ph.D. is in applied organizational psychology. And during that PhD, he researched flow theory, how, when, and why individuals, teams, and organizations can get into a flow state, the state of optimum human experience and performance. And most recently, his research in this area has explored how we can use technology-based solutions to nudge, to use the technical term, behavior change in order to develop key competencies for flourishing at work. And it was particularly interesting to chat to him today about, his research in this area. What did you most enjoy, Nick?
Yeah, so I think our listeners are going to hear, a bit more about how to think about this idea of the flow state, right? Connection to important work outcomes and how that relates to flourishing, how we might think about kind of work-life balance versus work-life synergy, and then some of the how-to pieces, right? Creating more flow in your life, of course, but also creating more flow for your team or organization. So enjoy our conversation with Jared and Gerrit. My guys. Oh, Gerrit.
Hey. Hello.
Of course, Gerrit comes in rocking the apple. Yeah, of course. I wish I had a wings hat, but no, all I got is piston. So you're in the Alps. Jared, you're what? Upper East Side?
Upper West Side.
Upper West Side, excuse me.
Give
me the cross streets.
I'm on 93rd in Columbus.
93rd in Columbus. Yeah. Now you sound like a New Yorker.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've been up here. We moved here in June, so before we were in Greenwich Village, probably a little hipper back then, but now not too bad for real estate either.
Yeah, no worries. I actually am home seeing my family, so it only takes me about 24 hours that I can use a few hour break from my mom. So this is perfect.
Awesome. Well, that's a wonderful place to call home. That's fantastic.
We'll edit that part out, Gerrit, in case she listens to this.
Please do.
And it's nice to hear someone pronounce mum as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's 9 years in Canada did that to me. So
yeah.
It tweaked my language a bit.
Love to kind of dig into your backgrounds a little bit. Obviously, we're talking about human flourishing, but we're going to talk more specifically probably about the place of flow, business, and entrepreneurship and human flourishing. So with that in mind, I'd love to hear how each of you kind of came to the points that you are in your both, professional lives. I guess we can do maybe age before beauty and start with Gerrit.
Damn it. I wanted to be the pretty one.
What happens
I don't know how to interpret that.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell my wife you said that.
Good. Please do.
I'll try to be as brief as I can. This can be a pretty long-winded story. But I've been a competitive athlete for quite a long time. I would say, I guess I'm a retired one now and more of a recreationalist, but I was a competitive whitewater kayaker for about 20 years and traveled all around the world, trying to huck myself off big waterfalls and challenged myself on big rivers. And I didn't know, I had heard of the construct of flow before, but I didn't really define it as such. I was a kid that had ADHD. I wasn't diagnosed as that when I was growing up. They didn't really call it that. The teachers just said Gerrit's disruptive and he doesn't pay attention in school. But I found this hobby, which was, kayaking down rivers, that made me incredibly present and incredibly focused. Is the most immersive experience that you can have, being in such a chaotic environment. And I was, hooked, hook, line, and sinker. And I did it 150, 200 days a year for well over a decade. And then as my career started to take off, post-grad school, and I started building ventures, I kind of felt myself going back to my childhood, where I had a lot of trouble kind of focusing and concentrating. And, I kind of felt my performance wane a little bit. Didn't really realize it at the time because I hadn't really deconstructed the concept of flow. But it was on one particular startup venture that was pretty high pressure. We raised millions of dollars. We're a fast growing company. Then I got way out of balance. I was working 16, 18-hour days, living out of a suitcase a couple hundred days a year, in a big pressure cooker environment, wearing many, many hats. Then it caught up with me. And, I ended up picking up all of the classic coping mechanisms. I started smoking cigarettes in my 30s. I started drinking more. I was never a big drinker. I stopped exercising. My sleep suffered, so much of, if I was tracking biomarkers at the time, I'm sure they would have been completely in the tank. Ended up kind of hitting full burnout. I got really lucky. I was able to sell the company and move up into the mountains, got a little piece of land, and basically started kayaking every day again, skiing all winter, kayaking all summer. And when I was doing that, I had a couple really profound experiences where I had the classic time transformative experience where I put in on the river, was kayaking by myself. An hour and a half later, I got to the end at the takeout. I pulled my skirt on my boat, and I realized that I had no working memory of what had happened the previous hour and a half before. At first, it kind of freaked me out. I started doing a little research, was reintroduced to the topic of flow. It was a lot of Stephen Kotler's work that brought me back to Csikszentmihalyi's work. Stephen Kotler did a lot of work on research on flow with extreme sports athletes. So he really kind of helped to unpack that construct in the environment that I was operating in. And I had this experience happen a few more times. So I started digging into it and I realized what was unfolding. And of course, naturally, the first question came is, why am I able to have this experience almost on command in certain domains of my life and struggle so profoundly to have similar experiences in other domains? So I started digging deeper. I thought I was going to write a book about it because I was also seeing a lot of other entrepreneurs facing similar struggles. This is the early 2010s. There were a ton of high profile founders, entrepreneurs that were struggling with mental health, that were struggling with performance, addiction, whatever it might be. And I thought I wanted to understand it a little better. Ended up meeting another former kayaker who convinced me, in my early 40s to take on Ph.D. research. So I decided to take a sabbatical from life and do a Ph.D., which was on flow and entrepreneurs, trying to understand the kind of antecedents of flow in an environment where I hypothesized would be very hard for many people to kind of find that state. So here I am.
Some sabbatical, spending it on a PhD. Right?
It's enjoyable. That's great work. It's meaningful work.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get into that more. But yeah, just listening to your backgrounds and other interviews you've done, I think it's interesting that, Jared, we're going to pop over to you in just a sec, but it seems to me that you've both kind of had somewhat similar paths in that you started with a thing, right? Gerrit, yours competitive whitewater kayaking, Jared, yours music, I think, but eventually arrived to sort of similar points where you're helping businesses, whether it be startups or big businesses and consulting, kind of think about flow and optimization and performance and its impact on flourishing there. So, Jared, you could tell us a little bit about your story and how you came to kind of a similar place?
Sure. Yeah. So for me, I always wanted to pursue music. I was a musician my whole life. I kind of went to college as a backup plan, but ended up performing a lot in school. And then coming out of school, I pursued a career in music for about 3 years. And part of what I think made my like being a musician so enjoyable was the feeling of being in flow, that feeling of being in the zone while performing. And the feedback that I would often get was that aspect of my performance, being in the zone, like visibly people could tell that like I gave my all. I kind of like let myself go on stage and was my most like authentic self. They would say, "Oh, like I loved watching you because I could tell, how into it you were." And like just that feeling was so amazing, alone and in a group, right? Performing, I was in a cappella groups and in bands, and that individual flow, but also that feeling of like being enmeshed in this like point in time together with a group of people doing something that's really difficult but achievable at the same time. And then like losing track of time in that performance. And when it's over, just feeling, like, wow, it's the best feeling in the world. That's really what drove my music career. And about 3 years into it, I stopped feeling that feeling on stage. It was something about just playing empty rooms in New York in these crappy, places, just to kind of like get that place on my resume for the next performance that I was going to do at 10 p.m. on a Monday night to an empty room for no money. It started to really like stop being enjoyable. And then I stopped feeling that feeling while I was performing. And then I started to feel, well, if I'm not feeling this, then others probably aren't feeling it when I'm performing anymore. And that's what kind of made me pivot and switch to startup life. So I started working in ed tech startups. I had done some work in like solar startups that a friend of mine had started, and ended up in DC working for an education technology startup. And during that period, I started to feel like something similar to that performance feeling while I was working. Like I was, involved with so many decisions. I had to do like so many different types of tasks that were challenging yet exciting to me. So I started to feel that feeling of flow in my work in the startup environment. And also I started to perform at open mics in DC again. And I started to feel flow while performing again because it wasn't my main thing anymore. I think there was a lot less pressure on me. And, for a bunch of reasons, I decided to go and do my master's in industrial psychology. The startup that I was working for was doing very well. And I felt that, if something happened, if we got acquired, having a bachelor's and, not that many years of experience, I was underqualified to be doing the work that I was doing in my role at that point. So I did my master's in industrial organizational psychology. While I was doing that, I read an article about mindfulness and flow and mind wandering in the workplace. And I'd been practicing mindfulness since I was about 12 years old. So I was very familiar with like what that was, like the construct of mindfulness or whatever, but I had never put a name to the feeling of flow before. And so when I read this article, the author's name was Scott Dust, who I've since become close with and co-authored articles with, after that, I thought, wow, like this feeling of flow, this is what I've been feeling at work now. This is what I felt as a musician. The article really talked about how it was very understudied in the workplace compared especially to like mindfulness at that point. And I saw a big gap in the literature and thought, oh, like I can do this. I can become an expert in this area. And then my experience with technology led me to think, oh, I could also tie technology into this equation and see if I can use nudges as a way to help teach people some of the things that they can do in order to get into flow. There was no research. There was like literally no empirical validation of any kind of flow interventions in the workplace that existed at that point. And so I said, this is my mission. I see, the sort of the theoretical things that I can contribute, but also like in practice, I think that this can make a big difference in people's lives. And so I went full steam ahead, and the rest is history.
So let's get into this, a little bit more deeply and more nuanced then, because you're both referencing, I think, what we might commonly call sort of, antecedents of flow or flow triggers or different characteristics of the experience. And I want you to kind of tell our audience sort of what you both do and how you kind of apply flow to various business settings, and how you see that kind of related to human flourishing. But before we even get to that point, I'd love each of you to kind of define how you think of the flow state. Let's start with Jared and then bounce over to Gerrit.
Yeah, so I kind of think about flow in the classic academic sense in a way, right? That's how I kind of define it. So there's kind of 9 elements to flow. 3 of the 9 are potentially considered as prerequisites, but there's argument as whether they could be prerequisites and also part of the experience, which is kind of how I envision it. So it's this feeling of being in the zone where you have a clear goal. The challenge skill balance is in place. So this is when you have, a high level of challenge in the task that you're doing, but you also have the skill to meet the challenge of that moment. And you also have feedback, so you kind of know whether or not you are on your way to achieving that goal, right? So those are the 3 kind of prereqs. When those are in place, you feel reduced self-consciousness, so you're not really worried about whether or not you're doing a good job. You feel a feeling of control. Sometimes, time will feel distorted. It will either speed up or slow down depending on the situation. It feels really good. So there's this idea of intrinsic reward. You're very focused and block out distractions. And I'm trying to think if I missed anything else there. You guys can help me out if I missed anything.
You covered most of the bases, and we're going to want to double click on a couple, especially
for sure,
the feel good piece. But
I kind of feel like it's a holistic feeling of these things kind of combined, and that there are, in certain cases, more or less of a feeling of each of them. And that's part of the challenge in like measuring it at an academic level. But I kind of think if you feel multiple of those things at once, then to me, it kind of counts as a flow state.
Do you think, before we bounce over to you, Jared, as a follow-up, do you think, I often will describe it sort of as a spectrum. There's sort of like lack of focus or distraction. There's focus, there's hyper-focus, but then there's flow, right? Is that kind of how you conceptualize it as well?
Yeah, I feel like you kind of know it after you've been experiencing it. I think the next level is that you know it while you're experiencing it, but yeah, it's like that feeling when you like click into that place, right? Like you're right. Like you can be focused on a task, but not be in flow. But then all of a sudden, like you can feel that click happen. And like that to me is like the threshold. It's a little squishy there, but that's the space that we're in, right?
Yeah.
Well, can I ask on that? So Jared, do you think that, because some people, such as Martin Seligman, think that we don't really know when we're in flow in the present moment. It's retrospectively, we can look back at, wow, I was so absorbed in that, because you're so absorbed, you're just not conscious of it. But what you're suggesting is that we actually can be consciously aware that we're in flow at the time. Because if you're aware of that click moment, I'm in this now. So do you think that we can be aware in flow in the present moment?
So my personal, with no research on this area, I'm not actually aware of whether or not there's even a way to measure that. But anecdotally and in my like experience coaching people, I think that step 1 is realizing like, oh, I was in flow, right? That's sort of just understanding when it's happening to you so that you can sort of start to recreate the foundation for those experiences to happen. But then kind of the next level advanced, flow mastery or whatever is like, yeah, I'm in flow right now. Like, how can I keep it going without like kind of going over the, too far to the left or the right of the focus threshold, if that makes sense.
Right.
So like when you're performing and you're soloing and that you're doing a great job, right? Often what happens is people will fall out of flow and then they'll kind of mess it up from there. But I think, again, the next level is like, this is going well. I feel that I'm in this pocket. Like, just keep it going and like relaxing yourself and like trying to like not overthink it, but keep focused. To me is like that next level that becomes very difficult for people.
It strikes me that this might be part of the place where we get this notion of like getting in your own head, right? Like you actually don't want to do that in some of these cases. You want to just go and kind of let it be once you enter that state. So Gerrit, you see flow in a pretty similar way?
Yeah, I mean, generally, yes, but I do see it as a spectrum for sure, because I think there's certain domains of flow that are even more immersive than others. Like when I talk about flow and I think about it, I really think about it as this deeply immersive state, right? And if you're able to achieve this deep sense of immersion and presence, you end up feeling great afterwards. And sometimes you do really meaningful, really, really good work. I think one of Jared kind of named off most of these characteristics of flow. I think there's a couple others worth mentioning, right? One is this idea of time transformation, right? That when you're so deeply in the zone that you essentially lose sense of time, right? And I think like there's some neuroscience hypotheses around this with the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of responsible for your time and space awareness, and whether that actually slows down in that state, I think is still up for debate. But certain environments of flow, I completely had lost sense of time. 100%. It was almost like I was knocked unconscious and I woke up an hour later and had no recollection of what was happening before. I've had other flow experiences in work or also playing music or doing other complex pursuits where I've definitely had it, but not to that degree. Now, my kind of key trigger in those really deep immersive experiences was risk, right? When you're dealing with life and limb, to me, that's a really deep trigger. I think you can have social risk as well. I imagine if I was playing music on stage in front of 1,000 people, some of those same, dynamics might come to light. So for me, there are different degrees of it. When I've been deeply in it, I have not been able to be aware of it. And I would hypothesize that if I had become aware of it, I would no longer be in it to that degree. I think the one other piece of kind of the components of flow that's worth mentioning is what Csikszentmihalyi called the autotelic personality, right? Which is all around the topic of motivation, right? That you're pursuing an activity simply for the sake of doing it. You would be doing it regardless if you were being recognized or rewarded for it. So I kind of think of this as there's a couple different layers to it, right? You've got this kind of foundational layer of motivation, right? And understanding your why. And then you can start looking at these different characteristics. I would say my research kind of looks at a layer in between, which is kind of your biology and how are you priming yourself biologically and psychologically to prepare yourself to be able to unlock those different triggers. And then how do you adapt your environment to be able to kind of unlock those different levers and play with them and adapt them so you can kind of push yourself back into that flow state.
I think this is a great discussion, in-depth discussion of flow, and it's amazing to draw on your research expertise and experiences in these areas. Let's try and connect this up with human flourishing, if we can. So we've seen various ways that for you both, flow is where you found yourself performing at a very high level in the zone, as Jared put it, which is kind of the paradigmatic example, if you like, of flow, and where you were at a professional level in some activity, and where and we've connected that a bit with happiness perhaps as well, where Jared was in particular describing how people watching him perform saw that he was just so immersed in this thing, that he was one with it, that it was really his authentic self coming through. So I'd like to ask each of you, perhaps starting with Jared, because we just heard from Gerrit, how you might connect this up with human flourishing, where we think of that as living a good life or having very high well-being, for example, in terms of how you feel it contributes towards your overall happiness or life satisfaction or fulfillment of potential and these kinds of areas.
Yeah, so for me, the reason that I've kind of been able to focus on flow in the domain of work specifically, because my degree is in organizational psychology, really is that flow itself has been shown to be a predictor of a lot of really important work outcomes that I would kind of associate with flourishing, specifically at work, right? So in my research, we've looked at flow and burnout and how flow actually reduces burnout, and flow and engagement, how flow leads to engagement in the workplace, and also performance. So you tend to perform, at your best when you're in flow. So that's why I think flow is sort of, in this flourishing conversation. I love it because it is like a three birds plus with one stone type of thing, where if you can create an environment for your employees, or as an individual, create the environment for yourself where you're experiencing flow, then you get all of these great outcomes associated with it, using not that complicated things, essentially. So, there's all these theoretical reasons for why I think flow, increases well-being and decreases stress and increases performance, all those things. But that's kind of the core of why I think flow is associated with flourishing.
Great. Thank you. Let's zoom in on one of those, two of those that are related. So stress and burnout. Then it seems that flow is, or at least trying to increase the prevalence of flow experiences in a person's life, can mitigate or prevent one of the most damaging and pernicious things in the modern world, stress, particularly workplace-related stress, which at its peak would result in burnout. So can we zoom in a little bit more on that and talk about your work in that area? What in particular are you interested in and working on the relation between flow and stress?
Yeah. So in my research, I've shown that flow can reduce stress, or the experience of flow makes people report feeling stressed less. And in a lot of ways, I think some of the core aspects of flow naturally reduce stress, right? So the challenge skill balance is one of the key elements of flow that actually some studies measure flow experience just in the sense of did you feel like you had that challenge skill balance in place, which is, I don't think, the best methodologically, but it shows you how kind of core to flow this idea is. So the theory goes that, when you have high challenge and low skill, that you feel stress and anxiety. When you have high skill and low challenge, then you feel boredom and apathy, right? And so by putting elements in place that make you experience flow, you're sort of making people come out of that stress zone and reduce that feeling of imbalance, which I think just makes people feel better and feel less stressed because of that. Just that natural ability. If you're in flow, you have to be in that challenge skill balance zone. So it's almost like you can't be stressed if you're experiencing flow, right? It's part of the kind of elements of it. And then that intrinsic reward as well, when you feel you're accomplishing something, you're operating at the edge of your ability, but still flourishing, then that feeling of well-being also increases your self-efficacy or your beliefs in your ability to do things. And I think that also increases your well-being in the short term and in the long term, just from building that up over time.
Yeah. So you brought out here a wonderful possible tension that I want to draw attention to and discuss between some of the things that you've just said, Jared, and something you said earlier, Gerrit, in relation to flow. So you observed, Gerrit, very interestingly, that you see higher levels of anxiety sometimes bring people you work with in the entrepreneurial space into a higher flow state. One would think that higher anxiety results in, and almost is, the same as high levels of stress, or as a form of high levels of stress. As Jared's just, commented from his research, low level of, flow is used to reduce stress, and in the flow state, almost you can't feel stress. So can the two of you help me resolve this tension? Because this is fascinating.
I mean, I'll tell you from my side that, I don't think higher levels of anxiety are enabling of flow. I think being more comfortable under duress will enable you to be, to have a greater chance of getting into flow. Stress is an incredible motivator. And I think sometimes we think of stress negatively. And so much of the dialogue that we hear is like, stress is unhealthy, stress is killing you. But stress is the thing that gives us perseverance. It's what drives us. It's what helps us push our boundaries, and, we're talking about, when we're talking about the challenge skill balance that Jared so eloquently mentioned, it's stress that's kind of, forcing us to push the boundaries of what we're comfortable with. So I think those things actually go hand in hand. If you have, deep anxiety, you are not going to get into flow. Like it's quite paradoxical to the flow experience, because one of the kind of core definitions of the flow experience is that, your kind of ego melts away, your sense of self is reduced, and you kind of, your actions and awareness merge, and you kind of become part of the experience, kind of the protagonist of the journey, rather than in conflict with whatever it is you're doing. So yeah, I do think anxiety as it's defined is problematic, but stress is, to the right degree, whether it's physiological or psychological stress, is, what pushes us to achieve and, pushes us just beyond our comfort zones, where the magic happens. If we're always operating within our comfort zone, it's too easy, and we're not going to find that kind of rewarding experience and that kind of joyful moment that pushes us into that level of flow and flourishing and feeling those feelings of accomplishment that are so meaningful that make us want to get up and do it again.
Great.
Yeah, well, I want to speak to the kind of the dynamism of flow that I think we're eliciting here in this conversation. And Jared, I like what you mentioned. You're kind of, killing three birds with one stone here, a lot of birds with a stone. Although my co-director at Shipley is a big PETA fan, and she'd prefer that we say we feed birds with scones. As
multiple birds with one stone.
Yeah.
I like
that. Not to get too into the weeds here, but I think something you're both bringing up is like, when we talk about reducing stress through flow, what do we mean by the stress? Do we mean perceived stress on a self-report measure? And then Gerrit, to your point, like you might say, well, if somebody feels they can take on a challenge, it's actually not a harmful stress. It's an exciting stress. It's a meaningful stress, right? So like, what is the creator of that stress? How are we responding to it? And then subsequently measuring it, right? If you can meet that challenge, that's where, Jared, you mentioned the growth of efficacy and confidence, right? The deeper forms of engagement. So, these different birds that we're talking about, I mean, in terms of flourishing, I see potential reduction in ill-being, whether that's stress or anxiety, right? An increase in confidence, an increase in engagement and sense of personal growth, and autotelic experiences, which tend to be highly motivating, deeply meaningful, and extremely fulfilling, right? So we're doing a lot of great stuff here just from one sort of, neurophysiological state, which is pretty incredible. Jared, you wanted to jump in here and maybe kind of reconcile some of these thoughts, or did I just summarize it?
No, I mean, I think you touched on it very well. I think one of the other things that I love about this whole theory and practice is that a lot of the dimensions that are associated with flow seem very simple on their kind of surface, right? Clear goals, the challenge, skill, balance, feedback. Those are, like clear goals, right? Like, yeah, obviously I need to know what I'm doing, but goal setting is a very deep theory in itself where you can get into, the nitty gritty and the details. Goals themselves can mean almost anything. Feedback is a whole area of research that, you could give people horrible feedback. You could give them great feedback, right? I think the challenge skill balance is extremely complex because it's actually all about perception, right? Both challenge and skill can be extremely subjective ideas. And so when we're coaching people, how to help them to kind of increase their ability to get into flow, it's often just about reframing the challenge, the stress-inducing, what they call distress, into eustress, right? Just reframing this idea that the thing that you're going up against is this impossible thing to beat, rather than like a puzzle that we're going to figure out together. And then once you kind of like think, reverse engineer the goal from, this huge high level goal that's going to take years for you to accomplish, down to like, all right, let's get started today on like this task, and this task that will eventually lead you to your goal. Then the challenge skill balance kind of like in your mind comes into, a more manageable place. Yeah. And then those kind of strategies that are very difficult to learn if you've never thought about them before in the past, but with some practice, with some coaching, like starts to become a habit that you constantly are, reframing stressful situations as challenges that are, possible to overcome. Then you start to get into flow more, and you get all of those kind of downstream, benefits from it.
Yeah, the reframing piece is so important. The idea that kind of stress or any of these triggers can essentially be experienced subjectively, right? Like they're based in part or oftentimes based on perception. You also mentioned clear goals, which I think is a particular area of expertise of yours. I know you just recently published a paper, which I'd love for you to plug. But also maybe if we want to go down that road, because you have a particular area of focus in SMART goals, and depending on the way you lay out the acronym, sometimes I've seen the A as achievable, sometimes I've seen the R as realistic, but either way, those speak to what you're talking about. When I take on a goal, do I think it's actually possible? I don't, for instance, have to run a marathon, all 26 miles at once. I just have to put one step in front of the other over and over and over again, right? Will you take us into a little bit of the research on kind of SMART goals, clear goals, and that achievable piece?
Yeah, so goal setting theory is one of the most robust psychological theories that exist. There's so much good evidence for Locke and Latham's goal setting theory, right? And part of the tenets of goal setting theory are like you have to set specific goals that you can measure and that are challenging and not overwhelming, right? These are kind of also tenets of flow theory, right? That challenge skill balance is really important, like we've been talking about. And so the framework of SMART goals, which I'll run through, so there's lots of different ways that the acronym has kind of, shown itself in the popular literature, right? But the ones that I like to use are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-oriented. So specific is, rather than saying, I'm going to make a bunch of phone calls today as a salesperson, you would say, I'm going to make, 20 phone calls. So like putting a number on it that you can then, measure, which is the M, right? And then achievable. So if you just put an arbitrary number on your goal and you put it way too high, then you're unlikely to kind of reach that goal, because you're going to either realize, I'm never going to achieve this. And so, you don't even try, or you try and you burn out and you get really upset with yourself for, not being able to do that, which also doesn't bode well for like using the strategy again in the future. So that achievable part is important. Relevant is just something that you actually care about and you think that it's worth putting your energy towards. And then time oriented, it makes there be kind of defined end date to when you need to achieve the goal by, so that it's harder to kind of procrastinate and, just like not do it, because it's still your goal. You're still like on your way to achieving it, but you don't actually have to take action or hold yourself accountable for getting it done in a certain period of time. So I've done some research that was recently published along with my co-authors, David Cassell and Tom DePatie. Basically what we did was use nudges. So we had an app that we used, and there was an experimental and a control group. In the experimental group, we sent them an alert in the morning, and we just said, here's what SMART goals are. And we kind of gave them the similar, we spelled it out, what the SMART means, and then gave the example that I just kind of gave as far as like SMART goal versus not SMART goal. Asked them to set 3 in the morning. And then throughout the day, we measured their stress, their flow, then their engagement at the end of the week, and also their performance, like how well they felt they performed that day. And what we found was that in the people in the experimental group experienced more flow throughout the day, and also their flow actually stayed more consistent across the week that we ran the experiment on. And that flow led to less stress, higher engagement, and higher self-reported performance. So it's pretty simple. The core of this experiment came from me actually using this on myself for several years before, where I set a reminder for myself to write some stuff down in the morning for stuff that I should be doing that day. As an entrepreneur, it's hard to the day is up to you, right? And so sometimes if you wake up and you don't have a plan, then 5 o'clock comes along and you're still binging something on Netflix and didn't get anything done, rather than saying like, I need to get this done, and this done by the end of the day, and actually like sitting down and doing that. It was a really useful tool for me, and that's kind of the beginning of this research. That's how it started.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thank you for that, and congrats on the paper. I know you said it's behind a paywall, but we'll link it in the show notes still.
Yeah, for sure.
That's a great segue back to you, Gerrit, because you are also conducting research, but I think more specifically on entrepreneurs sort of out in the field. And I've heard you describe it a little bit. Will you tell us kind of what you're working on right now in terms of the research piece?
It's an exploratory study. The data's been collected, so now it's a crazy amount of quantitative analysis. But what we basically did is we recruited a bunch of entrepreneurs in a control group. They were all in a startup accelerator program called Techstars, which is 14 weeks long. And they kind of go through the same type of curriculum and process through that 14 weeks, culminating in a day where they pitch their ventures to investors. So they're all kind of operating on a similar process and a similar time horizon. Albeit all of the ventures and the founders were very different from different backgrounds. So what I did was I gave them these fitness trackers that are called Whoops that you can wear on your house. They're great. So you wear them on your wrist 24 hours a day, and it essentially checks your heartbeat 100 times a second. And through a bunch of algorithms, it can identify some pretty interesting physiological data. It breaks down your sleep quite comprehensively. It measures your nocturnal heart rate variability, so you get a little understanding of your sympathetic, parasympathetic response, respiratory rate, resting heart rate, a lot of kind of stress indicators in there. So we gave them these fitness trackers, and then I got them to report a flow scale every day. So, 5 days a week during the program, they reported on flow experiences. And then we had another layer of data as well, which is what they were working on during that day. So what we're essentially doing is linking their high score flow experiences, their low flow experiences to what they were doing and what their physiology looked like in preparation to it. Because really wanting to understand, like, what are the physiological antecedents of flow? And of course, and secondarily, what are the work environment conditions that may enable or inhibit it in this entrepreneurial context? It's worth mentioning These are early stage startups. They've built some type of product. They have a little bit of early market traction, but they have very limited resources. They're running out of money quickly. They're moving at an incredibly fast pace. The first 2 weeks of the program, they meet with 10 mentors a day for half an hour each in rapid fire succession. And they do that for 2 weeks straight. So by the end of the 2 weeks, they're already absolutely knackered. This happened during, John, you like that? Because they used some British lingo again.
Yeah.
But it was also during times of COVID. So they were doing this. It was hybrid, then it was all virtual. They were adapting to new working environments. They were spending their whole day like we are right now on a camera. So there were a lot of interesting dynamics at play. Of course, different people, I was able to see their performance. So people were logging daily meditations, weightlifting sessions, runs. I saw when people took a weekend to go skiing and what that did for their flow experiences. So they were pretty methodical in tracking their kind of day-to-day lives. Like some others, I mean, it would have been nice to understand their nutrition, things like that, but we see alcohol consumption. They reported each day how they felt about their sleep. So I have this massive, massive data set. So we're literally, comparing different variables one by one. With, I think, about 70,000 data points is what I'm dealing with and kind of trying to identify these pieces. But we are seeing a few things that I can say early is that the really challenging, very focused tasks seem to be the most flow inducing. The ones that were collective, creative tasks were really, really flow inducing. And then interestingly, and just to spin it back to our beginning of our conversation of how, Jared and I found flow in other domains, when these people undertook, very intrinsically motivating activities on weekends, like going skiing or going climbing up a mountain or going hiking or playing in the outdoors and turning off, their flow scores increased substantially for the next 3 or 4 days afterwards. So there's some interesting data that's starting to unfold, but still a lot to be looked at.
I'd love to kind of ask, because I've heard you describe, the ski weekend and some other aspects of these people's lives and another podcast that you were on. I think something you, at least anecdotally, are seeing is that there tends to be sort of a point of diminishing returns. And I think this ties us back nicely to flourishing, especially in sort of the burnout culture that certainly the US exists in, or I think many corporations sort of promote. My general understanding, I'd love for you to go in a little bit more detail, is that when you see sort of entrepreneurs, or in some case engineers, who just sort of push and push and push and sacrifice working out, sleep, taking breaks, whatever it might be, what are you seeing happening to their markers and specifically to their experiences of flow?
Well, there were a handful of participants in the study that were what I would say pretty out of balance. I saw heart rate variability scores drop 50 points from their average. Sometimes 3-4 nights in a row, people sleeping less than 2 hours a night. Some people that got zero physical activity over 14 weeks, and they were not reporting much flow experience at all. So this kind of, actually, to steal Stephen Kotler's words that I love so much, which is this idea of making your biology work for you, right? The people that were committed to, and maybe we can talk about this later, but especially in the entrepreneurial world, when you talk about measures of success, the unit of analysis is almost always the firm.
Yeah. My
argument is the unit of analysis, when you want to predict, success, has to be the individual. And when, I had some founder teams that were very active, they meditated, they ran, they lifted weights, they literally broke up their days and kind of amortized their work over a longer period of time with breaks to do enjoyable tasks. They almost exclusively reported higher than everybody else on flow experience, overall well-being, jury's out on the efficacy of the business in the end, but so far, they have very sustainable trajectories. The people that weren't very well balanced, and I still keep in touch with them, mentor many of them on the business side, and you're seeing that very classic roller coaster ride of this entrepreneurial journey, which is so typical, right? You have really big highs and really big lows. We're always trying to coach people to kind of lop off the highs, check your ego at the door. The big highs don't mean anything, lop off the lows. It's a cyclical process. And the ones that seem to have more variability in their kind of perceptions of their experience are showing very similar variability in the kind of growth trajectory of their businesses too.
Is it fair to say that, I mean, for both of you, and maybe Jared, we'll start with you, it strikes me that this is probably why somebody who's interested in flow also, or business also ends up interested in flow, is like, it seems to me you guys are trying to kind of find that sweet spot, right? Where a business can perform well, individuals can perform well, they can crush it, but they can feel good while they're doing it and remain in balance. And there's sort of a win-win-win all the way around. I see you both shaking your heads, but Jared, is that kind of what you're after sort of in your role in research?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a million different things, right? But to me, what I like about it is the idea that if people feel great while they're working, then they'll do great work, right? And that they'll be less stressed, and that less stress actually leads to people taking less sick days, right? And that less sick days leads to lower insurance costs for organizations, right? There's all of these like actual bottom line things that organizations should be interested in that are related to flow. And at the same time, for individuals, there's all of these well-being, variables that are associated with flow. So by giving both sides, the organization and the individual, the tools that they need to help, get into flow and to flourish, you're helping everybody achieve everything in a way. And I think, the old school mentality is for organizations to get as much juice out of their people as they can, and treat them like a commodity that, is replaceable. In the current situation where the kind of tables have been turned and the individuals really have the negotiating power right now, organizations are forced to kind of think about this new way of treating employees and allowing them to flourish. And in turn, they'll actually benefit from that as well in a way that they probably should have been doing for years, anyway.
Yeah. Well, and what I just heard you mention, and Garrett, I want to come back over to you, so kind of squeezing all the juice out of their employees. And what I think you're finding, Garrett, not surprisingly, is that you squeeze enough, you run out of juice.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is we squeeze ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. Especially entrepreneurs. You don't need mm-hmm. someone to squeeze you, right? Mm-hmm. You've got, especially when you're, charting new territory and you're trying to create something new. And I'm not a good musician like Jared, so business and entrepreneurship is my creative outlet, right? So it's not an issue of these external forces putting it on you in all situations. Sometimes it's happening internally. And I think the key thing that I think about a lot is if you look at what the data shows on the predictors of entrepreneurial success, the number one predictor is time and experience, right? Like there's the popular media leads us to believe that a successful entrepreneur is some 25-year-old kid in a hoodie hacking away in his basement. The data shows that it's someone with 20 plus years of experience. It's their third or fourth venture. The average age of an exited founder is 46 years old. So what does that mean? It's like, sorry to be cliche, but it's a marathon and not a sprint, right? So it's about fostering a sustainable path that you can keep yourself on for the long term, with enough challenge to motivate you, enough novelty to inspire you. And then, I like to use the analogy that weightlifters use, which is progressive overload, right? If you do the same thing over and over again, your muscles will adapt to it, right? So you got to lift a little bit more each time to continuously get stronger. The same approach, I think, is with business and with entrepreneurship. You need enough motivation and challenge to keep pushing it a little bit more, but not too much that your energy balance is all out of whack and you're going to crash and burn. The same analog of physical activity, I think, applies to mental and cognitive capacity. And that's particularly relevant today, right? Our entire kind of work culture was built on, the era of the assembly line and the Industrial Revolution and Henry Ford. Our 8-hour work days, our schedules were all built on, hey, you're working one part of the assembly line and you're doing your one task over and over again. But the new work environment means we have to engage in creativity, lateral thinking, human interaction, things that are much more cognitively, psychologically, and mentally taxing. So being able to self-regulate, but also being able to create a work environment that allows us to self-regulate is going to be critical for long-term success. And I think that's the piece that we're fundamentally missing. We're living in a new world that is still operating in structures of an old way of doing things.
Great. Thank you so much, Gerrit. Well, sorry, Jared, did you want to come in on that as well?
I was just going to say that, a lot of the time too, our culture does kind of drive this idea of like work, like never rest. If you're not like working, you're like leaving things on the table essentially. But in my experience with the coaching that I've done, often these entrepreneurs, especially who are driving themselves, like they come and they want more flow, but the reality is I have to convince them that if they take time to rest, if they take time to like do things outside of grinding, essentially, that they're actually going to recharge and that they're going to then go back to work and feel, much more rested, much more able to focus and to like get more done at a higher quality in a shorter period of time. And that taking that break is not actually really a break. It's a recovery to then be able to like rebuild your energy and really flourish, right?
Yeah.
Well, Gerrit mentioned weightlifting, and I mean, not only do you need to keep increasing the weight, you also need to take breaks in between the reps, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Then you also need to vary up the exercises you're doing. Variation. I once heard a PT say in the gym that the key to fitness is variation, or the key to certain kinds of strength training is variation of various exercises you do, which connects nicely with this general theme that both of you have described, which is balance is so important to really living a good life. And that brings us on very nicely to the next kind of theme we'd like to discuss, which is the relationship between work and human flourishing. And so far from this conversation, some of the key themes, it seems, are that we ought to get away from this view that to be productive at work and to live a good work life is just to grind away at it, is put many hours as you possibly can in at the expense of other areas of life. That's not going to be fulfilling or bring you happiness in the long term. It's also going to be really bad for your physical and mental health potentially, and other areas too. That's one of several examples. So, I'd like to ask you this kind of broad question, and this is particularly pertinent in this very rapidly changing world of work, and you two are at the forefront of this, working with startups and entrepreneurs and so on. So, Gerrit, let's start with you. Do you think there's a natural relationship between human flourishing and work? And what does that relationship look like to you?
Yeah, the short answer is absolutely, because work is a part of life. And oftentimes it is, realistically, it's almost 1/3 of our adult lives. And I actually get a little bit tired of some of these constructs of work-life balance. And, do you live to work or do you work to live? I think the fact that we simply try to separate these things out into two different buckets is problematic within itself, because now we're comparing, the time we might spend sleeping or the time we spend with our loved ones or doing the things we love with this other thing that we may do partially extrinsically, partially intrinsically, maybe a combination of both, maybe skewed one way or the other. And because we throw these things into three different buckets, we're now assessing trade-offs between them. Oh, if I work more, I'm going to sleep less, or if I do this more, I'm going to spend less time with my family. And we end up playing this constant game, shell game, kind of trading off between all of them. And to me, if we look at life a little bit more holistically, and now I think it's worth mentioning, like, not everyone is so fortunate that they can say, hey, I'm going to create a work experience that jives with my life. There are many people in the world that just have to grind and have to do something very unpleasant to feed their families. But that is, and in those circumstances, you're dealing with some different situations. But at least I think the people that I tend to work with, I'm guessing a lot of the people Jared tend to work with as well, knowledge workers, entrepreneurs, they do have a little bit more blurring of those lines, yet they're spending a lot of time trying to separate those things out. And I think if we just look at work as part of life, and something that we want to try to find joy in, just like we want and maximize our efforts with, just like we want to do with sleep or with recovery or with family time, we can start finding experiences that are leading us to a life worth living, a flourishing life. When we start parsing them out and we're all trying to achieve, a positive experience, optimal performance, flourishing, whatever kind of language you want to put around it, now you have to do it in 3 different buckets, which creates greater pressure, greater stress, greater uncertainty, more interventions, and more complexity.
Well, synergy, right? Make it synergistic. Yeah. I more and more I'm railing against this idea of balance and more synergy. How do you fuse all of this together in a way that's really holistic?
Okay. So Jared, on to you as well. So how do you see this relationship between work and flourishing, and perhaps do you see it in terms of synergy or balance, the relationship these areas of our life have with one another, leisure, work-life balance, or work-life synergy, and so on?
I think it's hard to make broad, assumptions is the word that I would say, right? Because for some people, work is life, and you identify as your work self, right? I'm an organizational psychologist, right? When I go to parties and people say, "What do you do?" That's what I say, right? And
do they keep wanting to talk to you after you say that, or
it's funny because they do, but then especially when I'm like, "Oh yeah," and I study flow, then they're like, "Oh, definitely," and then a crowd of people, it's like, "Oh yeah, how do I get into flow at work?" For sure, but I think for some people that work is life, right? And that your identity, especially for entrepreneurs, because you are really investing your ideas, your whole self is in work. And in that case, I think it's super important for you to feel flow at work, to really flourish in that domain of your life, right? Because it encompasses so much of the Venn diagram that is ourselves, right? At the same time, I think that there are people who, work in a job that's not that meaningful to them, that, really is you sign on at 9 and you leave at 5 and you leave everything that you did during the day at home, and at parties, your work is not the thing that you're going to be talking about, right? In that case, I think, it's okay to get that, the flourishing experience or whatever, outside of work, doing something completely different. And as long as you're kind of getting it from somewhere, that it's okay, if that makes sense. In an ideal state, I think you're peppering it in everywhere, but I think it really depends on the situation. And obviously my life is sort of dedicated to helping people get it at work. And so I would encourage that. But I think if people are like, "Oh, I don't feel this at work at all," then it can be okay for that to be the situation if you're sort of making up for it in other areas, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So
can I follow up with Jared's comment with a question?
Please do,
actually.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm going to throw it back to the whole group, because I am not well versed on the discourse around flourishing. Do you all think it's possible, to live, a flourishing life when 30% of it is dedicated to something that you don't find rewarding and meaningful?
So that's a great question. Breaking it down to the 30% is a tricky question, obviously, but I'm thinking of the book, The Job, Ellen Ruppel-Shell, who I think is at Northwestern, and talks a lot about the relationship between work and meaning. But it also, so, generally I'm going to say, if you don't find meaning in your work, I think you're fighting an uphill battle for sure, right? Especially if you have to spend 30% of more of your kind of daily hours allotted to that. But that also takes me back to the framing piece, right? Like, how do you frame subjectively your experience to find meaning in your work, right? To have that inherent sense of purpose. I'm thinking about stories of, cab drivers who think they have the best job in the world. They get to get people where they need to go. They get to chat them up and talk to them and get to know them. There's a lot of people for whom I think, they have jobs that other people would look at and say, there's no way I would ever do that. But for them, it is deeply meaningful. So, I think, no, there needs to be meaning in work, generally speaking. But, how you access that meaning is a trickier sort of question.
You want to come in, Jared, before it?
Sure. Yeah. I would just say that people can have jobs that they're good at that they don't necessarily like doing. And the fact that they do it well and that they get paid for it and they can use the resources that they get from their work to then flourish in their family lives, right? And really, I don't like this being a software engineer, but I'm not a software engineer, but I'm good at it. I get paid well for it, and it allows me to send my kids to private school or give them tennis lessons or whatever, and that fulfills me. So it's not the work itself, but that's a framing, I think, of why you would do something that you don't necessarily love or feel that much meaning in the apps that you're building, right? I build a shopping app for so-and-so, and it's not making the world a better place, but it's, filling this need that I have to provide for my family or whatever.
Yeah. I would follow on from Jared. So I in answer to your question, Gerrit, I would think, or I would argue that one can lead a flourishing life, even if 30% of it they don't enjoy. Maybe they significantly don't enjoy it. Maybe they really quite dislike it, but only if other factors are in place that compensate for that. If those factors aren't in place that compensate for it, that person's probably not going to lead a life in which they have a very high level of well-being. Other factors being, for example, a nice home life where they have a wonderful family life and very meaningful friendships. But what facilitates that life is having this profession that they don't find particularly meaningful or enjoyable, but it brings them sufficient or perhaps significant financial and material stability that provides for the other areas of their life. If that isn't there, then I think it would be, I would imagine most cases one would find that people didn't have very high levels of well-being and so couldn't be said to be flourishing. Well, that's defined in terms of well-being. There can be levels of flourishing. So it wouldn't be a really high, super flourishing life if one really didn't enjoy 30% of it. But I think it can be there's other factors in place. I think one other thing worth adding is that, human beings, we tend to look for meaning in things. We find meaning even in really unmeaningful things, especially when we're forced to do them or have, day in, day out. We have to cope with these things. This is, one of the people who's often referred to in flourishing research is Viktor E. Frankl, his famous book Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about the most extreme case of prisoners in concentration camps during the Second World War and how they found meaning in the suffering as a way of coping with what they had to do day in, day out as a coping strategy that got many people through this. For example, that life project they want to finish if they escape or if they're ever freed, or trying to find their loved ones if they ever get out of the situation. And of course, that's an extreme case, but to scale that right back, if you're doing this, a certain thing day in, day out that you don't enjoy, you're going to likely bring in some coping strategies to deal with that. one of which would be to find meaning in things that perhaps you don't find that intrinsically meaningful.
It's interesting you bring up two different points there, John. And you know this, I don't know that Gerrit and Jared did, but I spent 4 or 5 years consulting for an NGO in Vienna that essentially did sort of like alternative Holocaust education. So Frankl was a huge part of that literature. And what is Frankl just such an excellent example of? Like framing, right? How do you find meaning in an otherwise really disastrous and tragic situation? But John, the other thing you bring up, when we're measuring flourishing, right? So you mentioned Marty Seligman earlier. So let's take UPenn's PERMA profiler, which, PERMA is one of those kind of predominant measures of flourishing out there. Generally, the people who measure highest in flourishing on that profiler, which is a Likert scale 0 to 10, right? They usually measure at 7s or 8s, right? The people who measure kind of the highest in flourishing, they're not 10 out of 10. Not everything's perfect. There's almost always ways something can be better, right? And so I'm thinking about that, and you do the simple math. Well, that's about 20 to 30% of that scale. That's not exactly where we want it to be, which I think is just sort of an interesting connection here. I want to bring us back. As a great question, Gerrit, and I'm glad we could have that sort of side tangent. I want to bring us back to the business piece for a second. I want to ask how to. At the risk of kind of oversimplifying this, but you both coach and consult entrepreneurs, managers, leaders, execs, whoever it might be, on how to, I think, help their companies or themselves find some of this sweet spot: flow, satisfaction, fulfillment, efficacy, good outcomes. What are some of your kind of go-to strategies in your experience for how you help you kind of nudge people in that direction? Let's start with Gerrit and then jump over to Jared.
Wow. I mean, I think there's a lot, we could probably have a very long conversation about the different interventions that can be used. But I guess I'll focus on who I spend most of my time with, which are entrepreneurs. And I guess one thing they tend to have in common is the motivation is in place. What's not always clear is what the motivation actually is and what's driving it. So, I think I brought this up earlier, but, if you want to build a sound structure, you have to have a sound foundation. And to me, that foundation is motivation and goals, right? So not just having motivation, but unpacking it, right? Understanding intrinsically and extrinsically what drives you. As Simon Sinek says, being able to check in on your why periodically. And because when things get difficult, really being able to have that motivation to fall back upon. And then the other piece is goals, right? And goals is an interesting topic for entrepreneurs, particularly ones that are, working on innovations, technological or business model innovations, because it's the stacking of goals that's so important, right? Is understanding the long-term goals, the vision, where you're trying to go, obviously knowing what you need to do day in and day out, those kind of short-term goals and tasks. And what I always tell entrepreneurs is those things are relatively constant. You're just cycling through the short-term stuff, right? You're trying to accomplish what you need to get done. The long-term stuff is that framework for analysis. It's the kind of North Star that's giving you a guiding light to make sure you're always going in the right direction. But for entrepreneurs, it's all the stuff that's in the middle that's constantly changing, right? Those midterm goals, weekly, monthly, quarterly, new information arises, new competitors enter the market, new technological opportunities happen, new business opportunities happen. So this is a very dynamic process, right? So having your goals kind of a framework for your goals laid out that is adaptable to change is really, really important. Then there's a lot of tools to be able to do that. Above that is, of course, I think one that is neglected very much in the psychological world, which is the biological, right? Making sure we've got our physical well-being addressed. We have good energy balance. We have the right kind of nutrition. We've got adequate sleep. We've got, active and passive recovery in place. Ideally, with an ability to measure it. So it's not just, qualitative and assumptive and reflective, but being able to tangibly kind of measure that piece. And then when we get above that, once we have the kind of motivation, goals, and biological pieces, then it's starting to unpack, the components of well-being and performance. And to me, those things, like using business speak, like, a good entrepreneur building a business is trying to unlock levers, right? And the more levers that you can pull on, the more you can affect change. And I think the same kind of metaphor exists with like performance and well-being. The more levers you have, the more tools you have in your toolkit, the more improvements that you can make. And those levers are vast. Some of them are very internal and psychological. Some are very work environment focused.
Yeah, there's so much there. And obviously, I think, Gerrit, you're primarily working with individual entrepreneurs or maybe smaller teams. Jared, is it fair to say that in your capacity as a kind of consultant for one of the big four, are you typically working with larger teams or full-on organizations and thinking more about systems or ecosystems more specifically?
Yeah. So in my day, I feel very grateful because in my day job, I really look at things from a macro level. And then, in my independent work as a coach, I'm able to do one-on-one with the individual. And, in the independent consulting firm that I started during my Ph.D. program, the Flow Group, like everything that I did used flow theory at each of those levels. So the clear goals, the challenge, skill, balance, and feedback are, again, those three kind of antecedents. And I think that they scale from the individual to the organization, right? And so a lot of the research in the workplace actually looks at sort of these org level variables, right? So, are there feedback like systems built into the processes of organizations, right? So many people, there's so much ambiguity in their workplace because they just never have those one-on-one meetings with their managers where their managers give them feedback, or they have those meetings once a year, once every 6 months, right? And by the time that they get that feedback, it's been, potentially 6 months or a year since the thing that they're getting the feedback on has happened. And it's like way too late to kind of make those adjustments. And so at the kind of org level, using those three prerequisites, I'm like, all right, you need to have like scheduled one-on-ones. Like managers need to make sure that they're giving the feedback that they need to give to their employees. Like people also need to know what the goals are that their role is expected to achieve, right? So, you could get to work and, one team has a manager that has like morning, scrum meetings, right? Where everybody kind of gathers around the table and talks about what their goals are for the day and what they need help with and those kinds of things. And then in the same organization, you just don't have a manager who does that. And people are kind of running around with like chickens with their heads cut off because they know what they were hired to do on paper, but they don't know exactly how to execute on those things. And so that just requires a little bit of managerial training and more communication from from the top down, right? And so, building those specific processes is a way for organizations to kind of make their whole culture a little bit more like flow friendly, I think. And I think that, alignment, making sure that those goals are kind of like, aligned from the top, like from the mission of the organization to their sort of larger bottom line goals for the quarter, for the year, those trickle down. So, if the company needs to make $1 million, that means that X teams need to make X amount of money, right? Like X proportion of those, and setting those goals accordingly in a way that, again, is not overwhelming. This is the challenge, skill, balance portion of that, right? Is like, are you setting the goals for your departments, for your teams, for your individuals at levels where they'll actually be able to accomplish those? Or are you overwhelming them from the start and setting them up for failure by like setting these crazy high goals that are just never going to be accomplished, right? And organizations want to do that because they think setting this number makes people have to strive for that and get there. But the reality is that it can be, very demotivating. So working with organizations to kind of like realize the importance of putting these structures in place in the first place, I think is a really important, kind of way to approach this issue. And then, at the kind of like team level, for managers to be able to understand, how much, you have a team of 5 people, not all 5 of them are going to have the same level of skill, right? They're going to need different challenge levels, different kind of personalized goals that motivate them in different ways. Some people need their goals to be like very clear and like very like, do this, then do this, then do this, then do that. Other people need to just be given a framework for like, I need you to like do this project by this time. And then you got to let them go and allow them to like do their own thing, right? So as a manager, like knowing your people, understanding who they are and how much kind of hand-holding they need, where those goals need to be set, I think that's really important too for kind of facilitating flow in the workplace. And I can keep going, but the individual level is the same, right? The individual level is like, do I know what I need to accomplish? Are those goals hard enough for me? And like the feedback is like looking back and saying, did I actually accomplish the goals or not? And if not, why? Or if so, why, right? So at each of those levels, I think, taking those 3 kind of prereqs in mind is really important.
And just scaling from there. I like that. It's very tangible. So Gerrit, you
Can
look like you want to jump in.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
I do, because this is one of my favorite topics, and Jared just kind of primed it really, really well. And I think it's really important to define the types of organizations too, right? Because, I'm a big believer that everything good fails at scale, right? Like the greater the scale you go, the more you require hierarchies, systems, and structures. And that's really important for certain types of organizations, but it's incredibly detrimental to others. So if you're an organization that produces widgets and now you're producing widgets globally, you've got these systems in place, these hierarchical structures that is going to optimize the production of those widgets, right? And it's imperative. And I think Jared mentioned a lot of components of that are really valuable. I want to look at the other side of that, which is growing organizations that are driven by innovation. And when you put innovation in the mix as the core kind of product or service of an organization, and you have hierarchical structures and lots of systems that give people very clear direction and KPIs of what they're supposed to achieve in their little layer, innovation tends to crumble, right? Because those individuals their goals aren't aligned hierarchically with the different layers of the structure. They have less autonomy. They have less opportunities to achieve mastery in the process. And they don't necessarily have the space to be able to drive novel ideas or creative pursuits. So how do you create innovative organizations that are scaling? That's where I think flow theory comes in as well, because some of the most relevant organizational tools of innovative organizations that are being used at startups all the way up to companies the size of Google. You can get some of these similar results, but you can do it in a much more empowering way that gives the individual much greater sense of control.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation, guys. This has been fascinating. So we have a final question we like to ask all of our guests. We call it the flourishing question. What's the one lesson on flow and flourishing you want our listeners to walk away with, and what might be a practical step for putting that lesson into action? Jared.
Ooh, okay. For me, the number one thing for me, I think, is the goal setting. I think that's the easiest, most practical thing that people can do if they're not currently doing it. They're just, there's all these theoretical things about how setting goals, makes it so you don't have to actually think about what those goals are for the rest of the day. It helps you to concentrate and like manage your time a little bit better. So for me, the goal setting strategy is the big takeaway. But I also, I think the framing kind of theme that we've been, touching on throughout the conversation is really one of the most interesting things to me about this whole space. Is it's often about how you look at the situation and how you decide to respond to it. And that is actually a learned skill that you can work on over time and improve at. That has a lot of beneficial, I think, downstream effects.
So next week, Jared, we are actually having a chat with Todd Kashtan, who is like one of the people in the world of psychological flexibility. So we might have to bring that back up. That'll be a lot of fun because he and his team, I think, just brought out or maybe just validated a new psychological flexibility measure that speaks, I think, I don't fully understand it yet. We're going to get into it with him, but speaks to some of those framing elements.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Gerrit.
Great.
Oh, one takeaway. Wow. That's I'm going to go back to my roots and my people, which are entrepreneurs and innovators. And I touched on this earlier, but I think it's really important is, all of the things we're talking about are humanistic pursuits. Humans are at the center of all of this. And, entrepreneurship business by definition is really defined as value creation, but value is not created by firms. It's not created by businesses. It's created by a collection of individuals working towards the same shared goal or goals. And I think we just need to start reframing the way we operate in the business world as being human-centered. And I didn't mention this before, but I spent the first decade of my career as a development economist. And one of my all-time favorite books was by E.F. Schumacher. It's called Small is Beautiful, and it's economics as if people matter. And I think it's about time somebody starts writing books about entrepreneurship as if people matter, and not just entrepreneurship as the people being the consumer, but entrepreneurship as people being the producer as well. Because if we can shift away from the firm being the unit and the individual being the unit, we can unlock an infinite number of interventions and environments that can empower people, right? And if the individuals working in an organization feel empowered, they feel autonomous, when people feel like they're part of something greater than themselves, that they're actually having an impact, have greater meaning, not only do they, have a more flourishing and vibrant existence as an individual, but the probability of the efficacy of whatever it is they're trying to do is going to increase.
Well, that's an excellent soundbite to sort of wrap up on. I do want to just add to it that, you guys don't know this, but John and I met through a community of practice run by the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. And specifically, we're both a part of a subcommittee on education for human flourishing. And I don't want to speak for John here, but I'm pretty confident we both feel that that's what education really needs to be thinking about, is how does it become more human-centered, not just about teaching what in large part are pretty irrelevant skills in a lot of cases and just trying to get people jobs or move them to the next level, but really help them sort of, to take Scott Barry Kaufman, right, self-actualize, become their best selves and really tap into, what I think is the world's single greatest resource, which is human potential.
Here.
Guys, this was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time, especially on a Sunday, to hang with us and talk shop.
Thank you so much. Where can people find out about both of you? Jared, where can people find out about you online?
Probably best for me is LinkedIn. Just Jared Weintraub. Find me. Feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk to people about really anything. But yeah, excited to have you reach out, and thank you both for having us. This was a great conversation. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you. And Gerrit, where can people find you?
I'm with Jared, mostly on LinkedIn. Most of my other social stuff is pretty damn boring. So unless you want to see pictures of the meals I eat around the world on Instagram, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. But, just to echo what Jared said, this is one of the most flowy experiences that I can have. I host a podcast as well. By the way, mostawesomepodcast.com. I guess that's my other plug if you're interested in entrepreneurs. But one of the things I love about podcasting, and actually it's one of my favorite things about life, is to talk about really important subjects with really incredibly smart and knowledgeable people. I always learn more than I can ever teach. And what another one of those great experiences today. So thank you for having me.
Cool. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the podcast. We'll throw that in the show notes as well here.
Absolutely.
But yeah, guys, you both rock. Really appreciate you. We'll see each other Thursday for the roundtable. Cool. Good. So I'll talk to you then. But enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and Gerrit, enjoy the Alps. I'm jealous.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Thanks,
all right, guys. Have a good evening.
All right. Have a good rest of the day. Yeah.
Huge thanks to all of you for listening to today's show.
If you like what you heard, please share it with friends, family, colleagues, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review. You can also find us on all social media platforms. We've got our own YouTube channel, and you can check out our website at flourishfmpodcast.com.
We'd also love to hear from you. There's a survey in the show notes you can complete where you can complete any suggestions on guests you'd like to hear us interview, or particular topics or themes you'd like to hear us talk about. We'd love to hear your feedback on that. So your feedback would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out that form. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us today.
And keep putting in the work.